Now, finally, what I'd like to do is put our question about what is philosophy, for the sake of this course, in an historical context. That is, ancient philosophy in an historical context. The idea is when you go to the theater, they give you a playbill telling you who the actor is. Or when a movie starts, you get to see who the stars are. Well, right now we're going to take a look at some of the stars of our world. When things really got started, it's a period that I'll call pre-philosophy. There's a gentleman named Hesiod who wrote mythology about how the gods brought everything forward. And then there's Homer. Homer is probably the one of these two guys that you're more aware of. And think about it. What is it that he wrote? Take out your paper, stop it, write it down. What are the books that Homer wrote? And I think you might have seen some of the movies. Well, Homer wrote two classical books. He might have written more, but there was the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Iliad recently has become both books have become the subject of movies. You might remember the movie Troy. The Troy is about the Iliad, where you have gods that are involved in a people's war between the Greeks and Troy, and you have Achilles and some of the other characters that you're familiar with. Well, I understand that the Odyssey, I'm not sure the Odyssey, maybe it's another one about the Iliad. There's a movie, Clash of the Titans, about that. But basically those are mythological stories about what's going on, and they deal with value, with reality, more in the superstitious light than in the light of reason. Following this period, we have the group that are commonly known as the pre-Socratic philosophers. When you heard Carl Sagan talking, he was talking about where Thales came from, Miletus, place in Turkey, but it was a Greek colony in Turkey at that point. And we talk about the guys who got everything started, Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes. Then they had explanations of where matter came from, and were giving explanations that were very much scientific, but they were also talking about the nature of the universe. Then the next character in our story, we probably won't spend any time on him, is Pythagoras. And you probably are all familiar with Pythagoras because of his very famous mathematical theorem, the Pythagorean theorem. That is, in a right triangle, a squared one side plus b squared the bottom is equal to the hypotenuse, c squared. The hypotenuse squared, that is. Well, Pythagoras had some interesting concepts about reality and their relationship to numbers, and he and his followers, well, it almost became a cult, worshipping numbers in a certain way. Then we hit a major character, Parmenides. Parmenides is actually the name of one of Plato's dialogues. Parmenides is a hero to Plato because Plato poses one of his major theories about how knowledge works, how you're capable of having knowledge. And in the Parmenides, he uses the character of Parmenides to point out the problems with his theory. And following that, Parmenides has a very weird theory, by the way. We're going to be reading that in our textbook. We're going to be reading some of his stuff in our textbook. That's going to be some of the most difficult stuff to read because it's a poem. And I'm really going to have to help you out to figure out what on earth he's talking about, in addition to which his view about what the world is, unlike in Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Thales, that they had some material object, is very strange. He has the view that everything that we see is not real, but what is real is one thing. The universe is one thing. I neglected to point out there's another person in here that I should have put in before Parmenides. It's Heraclitus. And Heraclitus is a kind of key figure, and really a key figure in shaping Socrates and Plato's thinking about things, because Heraclitus is the person who changed thinking, or changed the line of thought from thinking that there's a material component to the universe, that matter, that substance is the basic component. But for Heraclitus, he says there's nothing, it's not substance that's a basic component. There is no basic component that matters. Rather, the only thing that everything has in common is change. And Parmenides is almost a reaction to that, because if everything's changing, and we'll talk about this later on, if everything's changing, nothing is permanent, you can't know anything. So Parmenides goes to the other extreme. Zeno is a student of Parmenides. He's best known for his paradoxes, and what his paradoxes are arguments to show that time, motion, and space are impossible. And we'll take a look at those, at their arguments. There were people who were atomists that followed Zeno, and Anaxagoras is sometimes thought of as an atomist. They have theories about that really predate, or sort of not don't predate, but are the precursors, the intellectual underpinnings of our current theories in chemistry. That is, everything is made up of these small parts that can't be divided. They didn't have the concept of protons, neutrons, electrons. Rather, they thought all matter was made up of little parts. It's called a corpuscular theory, maybe little pieces. Everything was made up of little pieces of matter. Now, Socrates is really the major figure where philosophy gets started. And we really don't know what Socrates believed, because the only Socrates did not, I don't know if he did not write anything, at least nothing that he wrote ever survived. And the only reason we know about Socrates is through his student Plato. Plato uses Socrates as the main character in his dialogue, in many of his dialogues. He's the character through which Plato gives his theories. Now, the one explanation, according to scholars, is that in what they think are the earlier dialogues, the views that Plato is expressing are actually those of his teacher Socrates, and later on, in the later dialogues, the ones that Plato wrote later, he expresses his own views. And we know a little bit about Socrates both from Plato, and there was also a playwright, Aristophanes, who had some not so flattering, or had a play called The Clouds, and he describes Socrates in not so flattering a way. And you might be familiar with Socrates maybe in high school or another course you read, Plato's Apology, which is the trial of Socrates. At some point we will probably mention that in passing. And finally, Plato had a student named Aristotle. Very famous philosopher. Much of science was dominated by Aristotle from Aristotle's time, 300 BC, right until modern times. Aristotle made some scientific discoveries, logic, and Aristotle is probably best known by his student, who was not a great philosopher. His student was Alexander the Great, a man who conquered the world for the Greeks, lived to a not very old age, till his early 30s. He was not a great philosopher. His father had gotten Aristotle to be his personal tutor, and I don't think he spent a lot of time studying with Aristotle, but he certainly was a great leader. So these are really the main characters in our story, or the main actors whose works we're going to be reading, and we're going to be looking at it as we look at the specific problems that we will be addressing. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to turn into a slightly more in-depth look at the problems in philosophy, the central problems of philosophy, so that you'll get a nice well-rounded understanding of what the problems are, and I'll point out the problems that we will be discussing during the course of the semester then.